She knocked on 31 doors in this town. 31. With a belly that heavy and boots worn through at the heel, she knocked on every door that had smoke coming from the chimney. And 31 times, someone looked at her, really looked at her, and closed that door right in her face. The 32nd door wasn't even a door. It was a rotting gate at the edge of a dying orchard, and the man behind it hadn't spoken to another living soul in 4 months. She had nothing to offer him except her hands and a willingness to work through the night. He had nothing to offer her except a roof that leaked in 3 places. Neither of them knew it yet, but that was enough. If this story finds you tonight, wherever you are, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now stay with me. We're just getting started. The apples were falling on their own by then, not being picked, not being sorted or packed or loaded onto wagons, just dropping, one by one, sometimes in little clusters when the wind came down from the northern ridge, dropping straight to the ground where they split open and turned brown and sank into the mud like they were trying to disappear. The orchard had maybe 3 good acres of fruit left on the trees, and if someone didn't get to it in the next week, maybe 2 weeks if the temperature held, it was all going the same way as the rest. Down, rotting, gone. Garrick Hale knew this. He walked the rows every morning, same as always, same as his mother had walked them before him. He saw the fruit. He saw the color going wrong on the eastern slope, the soft spots spreading on the gravensteins near the stone wall, the wasps gathering thick around the windfalls because there were so many windfalls now that the wasps had more than they could handle. He saw all of it. He just couldn't make himself care enough to do anything about it. That was the part nobody in town understood. Or maybe they understood it fine and just didn't have patience for it. Mira Hale had been dead 6 months. 6 months was long enough, apparently. Long enough to grieve, long enough to get back to business, long enough to stop letting a profitable orchard rot on the branch while you sat in a kitchen that smelled like someone else's cooking and stared at the wall. Garrick didn't argue with them. He didn't argue with anyone anymore. He just stopped going into town. The morning Elara Whitlock came through his gate, he was in the far row trying to remember why he'd come out there. He had his leather gloves on. He had a picking basket. He stood in the middle of the row looking at a tree that still had 40, 50 good apples on it, and he thought, tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. He heard the gate before he saw her. The hinge on that gate was rusted to hell, had been since before his mother got sick, one of those things on the list that never got fixed, and it made a sound like something being hurt when it opened. Garrick turned around. She was standing just inside the gate, one hand still on the latch, the other pressed flat against the lower curve of her belly. Pregnant. Very pregnant. The kind of pregnant where you stop being surprised that a woman is pregnant and start being surprised she's still standing upright and moving around. She had a travel bag on her shoulder, a dark canvas thing, and even from 30 feet away he could see it was heavy, and she was listing slightly to one side because of it. She looked at him and he looked at her. "I'm not buying anything," he said. "I'm not selling anything." Her voice was steadier than he expected. She looked like she hadn't slept. She looked like she hadn't eaten a real meal in a while either, though he wasn't going to say that. "I heard you have an orchard." "I do." "I heard it's in trouble." Garrick looked at the apple in his hand, the one he'd apparently picked without deciding to. He turned it over. There was a soft spot on the underside, brown and sunken, the size of a thumbnail. He threw it aside. "Who told you that?" "A woman at the dry goods store. She wasn't saying it to be helpful. She was saying it to someone else, and I happened to be nearby." She shifted the bag on her shoulder, and he watched the effort it cost her. "My name is Elara Whitlock. I know how to preserve fruit. I know how to run a cold cellar. I know how to stretch a harvest through a winter, and I know how to keep livestock calm enough to work with." She paused. "I need a place to stay until my baby comes." Garrick waited to see if there was more to it. There wasn't. "That's your offer," he said. "Your labor for a room." "Yes." "You're 8 months along." 7.5. "You can't climb a ladder." "I don't need to climb a ladder. The fruit that needs saving is already on the ground or low enough to reach. Your ladder height fruit is lost. I'm talking about what's salvageable." She looked past him at the rows, and he had the odd feeling she was already calculating something, already running numbers in her head. "You've got enough left to matter. If someone gets to it in the next 10 days. Garrick put his picking basket down in the mud. He crossed his arms. He looked at her for a long moment, her worn boots, her coat that had seen better days, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than one bad night, the way she was standing with her weight shifted just slightly like the bag, and the belly together were more than she wanted to admit. "Where's the father?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Something moved behind her eyes. Not pain exactly, more like a door closing. Not part of this conversation. He nodded. He'd had a feeling that was the answer. "Where are you staying?" "Nowhere yet." "You came from town?" "I was in town this morning, and nobody—" He stopped. He knew the town. He'd grown up in it. He could picture exactly how that had gone, and something in his chest shifted slightly, an uncomfortable little movement he didn't examine too closely. "How long have you been on the road?" That's also not part of this conversation. She wasn't rude about it. That was the thing. Her voice stayed even, almost formal, like she was conducting a business transaction and had decided in advance which parts of herself she was willing to put on the table and which parts she wasn't. He'd met men like that. Women less often. Garrick picked up his basket. He looked at his orchard, at the rows of trees heavy with fruit that was losing ground by the hour. He thought about what the harvest would be worth if even half of it made it to buyers. He thought about the ledger sitting on his mother's desk. His desk now, technically, though he hadn't moved any of her things, and the column on the right side that had been shrinking since May. He thought about his mother, who had taken in 3 different stranded travelers in his lifetime, and fed every one of them until they were ready to move on, and what she would have said right now if she were standing next to him watching him hesitate. "The room above the kitchen," he said finally. "It's small. The window sticks. You'll want extra blankets." Elara Whitlock's expression didn't change much, but she let out a breath, slow and careful, like she'd been holding it longer than just this conversation. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The kitchen's a mess and I haven't lit the stove in 2 days." She walked past him toward the house, and he watched her go, this stranger with her heavy bag and her heavier belly, picking her way through the muddy orchard rows with more steadiness than he would have given her credit for. At the edge of the trees, she stopped and looked back. "The Gravensteins on the east slope," she said. "Those need to come down tomorrow morning before the frost hits. If you wait another day, you'll lose them." Then she went inside. Garrick stood in the orchard for another minute, listening to the wasps and the wind and the soft, wet sound of fruit hitting the ground somewhere in the rows he couldn't see. Then he picked up his basket and went to work. Her name was Elara, and she had been on her own for 4 months. Before the orchard, before the town that turned her away, there had been a boarding house in Mill Haven, 60 miles east. Before that, a cousin's farm. Before that, a room above a saloon that she'd left the moment she realized the saloon owner's idea of charity came with conditions she wasn't willing to meet. She'd had money once. Not much, but enough. And she'd spent most of it carefully, rationing it the way you ration water when you're not sure where the next well is. The father of her child was a man named Thomas Calloway, who had been charming and certain and completely full of promises he had no intention of keeping. She'd figured that out 2 months into the pregnancy, which was approximately 2 months too late. Thomas was not a cruel man. He was just a man who wanted things to be easy. And Elara, pregnant, determined, increasingly willing to say exactly what she thought, had stopped being easy around the time she'd stopped fitting into her regular clothes. He'd given her a small amount of money and a look that was half guilt and half relief, and she'd taken the money and left before she could say something she might not regret at all. She didn't think about Thomas much. She'd found that thinking about him was a form of energy expenditure she couldn't afford. What she thought about was the baby. She thought about the baby constantly, the way you think about the weather when you're living outside. Not obsessively, but practically, with the part of your brain that was always calculating, always planning. What the baby would need, what she would need to give birth safely. What kind of situation would be stable enough for the first weeks, the first months. She had a midwife's handbook she'd bought in Mill Haven and read until the cover was soft and the pages were bent at every corner that mattered. She knew what she was facing. She knew 6 weeks early was dangerous. She knew she wasn't due for another 6 weeks, but had been feeling things. Small things, probably nothing, that told her the baby was not going to wait politely for the expected date. This was information she kept to herself, along with most of her other information. You didn't hand people reasons to turn you away before they'd even had the chance to consider keeping you. The room above the kitchen was exactly as described, small, slant-ceilinged, with one window that stuck in its frame and a bed with a metal frame and a mattress that had been good once, maybe 15 years ago. There were spare blankets in a chest at the foot of the bed, folded the way someone careful would fold them, which told her something about the woman who'd kept this house before. Elara set her bag beside the door, not under the bed, not in the wardrobe, beside the door where she could reach it quickly. Then she went down to the kitchen and started assessing. The mess Garrick had warned her about was real, but not catastrophic. The kind of mess that comes from a person eating to survive rather than to eat. Tin plates stacked unevenly, a skillet with old grease, flour spilled at the base of the cabinet and not swept up. The pantry had more in it than she'd expected. Root vegetables, a ham hock, dried beans, cornmeal and salt pork, and 3 different kinds of preserving jars, most of them empty, which told her someone had known how to put food by and had done it regularly until they stopped. She found kindling and got the stove lit. It took 3 tries because the flue needed cleaning, and she made a note of that. While the kitchen warmed up, she went through every cabinet and shelf, touching, calculating, her mind already sorting itself into lists. What was here? What was missing? What could be salvaged? What needed replacing? By the time Garrick came through the back door with mud on his boots and an expression that said he'd been out in the rows longer than he'd planned, she had a pot of bean soup going, and the table was clear, and there was hot water in the kettle. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the kitchen. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know." She didn't turn around from the stove. "The flue needs cleaning. I can do it tomorrow if you show me where you keep the brushes." A pause. "Back of the barn. Left side hanging on the wall." "Thank you." He sat down at the table, which had not been a comfortable thing to do in this kitchen for a long time, and she put a bowl of soup in front of him and sat down on the other side with her own bowl, and they ate without talking, and the kitchen was warm for the first time in weeks. She worked. That was the thing about Elara that Garrick hadn't anticipated, though maybe he should have. A woman willing to approach a stranger's gate at her stage of pregnancy and make that kind of offer was clearly not a person who did things by halves. She worked the way someone works when they know exactly what they're doing and are focused entirely on the problem in front of them. The first morning, before he'd even had coffee, she was in the East Slope Gravensteins. He came out to find her at the base of each tree, moving slow but with purpose, lowering the ladder-height fruit with a long-handled picking hook she'd found in his barn, and clearly cleaned and oiled before using it. The fruit going into the basket was clean, unbruised. She was good with her hands, economical, not wasting motion. He put his coat on and came out to help. She handed him a basket without comment, and they worked side by side for 3 hours until his back told him to stop, and her face told him she wasn't stopping no matter what her back said. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "You're 20 minutes from being not fine. Sit down. I'll finish this row." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the sense she was running some kind of internal calculation about whether this was worth arguing over. She decided it wasn't. She sat on the stone wall with her hands on her belly and watched him work, and he could feel her watching, not critically but attentively, cataloging. He found it vaguely unsettling and entirely accurate. "You're doing it right," she said eventually. "I've been doing it my whole life. I know. I can tell." A pause. "The basket's almost full. Bring it back to the porch and I'll start sorting." He did. He watched her sort. Fast, her fingers reading the skin of each apple the way you read a page, feeling for soft spots, for the beginning of rot, for the places where the skin had broken and let in air. The ones she pulled aside she cut open and checked, and most of those she salvaged too, cutting away the bad part and setting the good part in a separate bowl for immediate processing. Nothing was wasted. He'd never seen someone work a harvest that way, with that particular refusal to give up on something just because part of it had gone wrong. "Who taught you all this?" he asked. She kept sorting. "My grandmother. She had a kitchen garden and a cold cellar, and she kept 12 people fed through 3 bad winters with what she grew herself. She said the difference between getting through winter and not getting through winter was what you did in September." Smart woman. She was the smartest person I ever knew. Said simply, without sentimentality, like a fact you state because it's true and not because you expect anyone to respond to it. Garrick went back to the trees. The days settled into a rhythm faster than he would have thought possible. He picked, she sorted, and preserved. She managed the cold cellar. reorganizing it completely in the first week, a process that uncovered several boxes of his mother's mason jars that had been pushed to the back and forgotten. And she made sense of the kitchen in a way it hadn't made sense in months. She cooked actual meals, not elaborate things, but solid ones. Things that used what was here and lasted and filled you up. She got the flue clean and the stove drawing properly. She found a problem with the water pump that had been half repaired and finished the repair herself with a wrench from the barn and a patience that Garrick found both impressive and slightly humbling. He helped. He was surprised to find he wanted to help, wanted to be out in the rows and in the barn and doing the physical work of the farm in a way he hadn't wanted to do anything in months. Some of that was probably just having someone else there, someone whose presence made the farm feel like it was being watched, expected to perform. Some of it was something he didn't look at directly. They talked while they worked. Not about important things, mostly. Not about her situation or his, not about Thomas Calloway or Mira Hale. They talked about the orchard, which varieties kept longest, how to tell when a wine sap was past saving, whether the soil on the western slope was too acid, and what to do about it. They talked about farming techniques, about cold cellars and root vegetables, and how to brine pork so it lasted through February without going wrong. She knew things he didn't know. He knew things she didn't know. This exchange of information felt, to both of them, more natural than it should have. One evening, after about 10 days, she came in from the cold cellar with her hair coming loose from its braid and a smear of something on her coat, and she said without preamble, "You're going to have enough." He looked up from the ledger. Enough what? Enough to get through winter. More than enough. She sat down heavily on the kitchen bench. She was moving with less ease now, the baby pressing forward, the late stage of it making every position a negotiation. The cellar's got 40 bushels in cold storage, plus what I've put up in jars. If I can get the pear preserves done this week and the apple butter next week, you'll have inventory to sell starting in February. Garrick set his pencil down. He looked at the numbers in the ledger, which had not been good news in a long time, and thought about what she was describing. February, he said, when buyers start coming back around. They'll want early varieties, preserved goods. You've got both. She stretched her neck, one side then the other, and he heard it pop. The farm's not saved, Garrick. I want to be honest with you, but it's not dying anymore. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the ledger, his mother's ledger, the pages she'd kept so carefully all those years. I know, he said. I can see it. She nodded. She started to get up and then stopped, one hand on the table, and for a moment her face did something complicated, a tightening, a careful, controlled stillness, the kind of expression you make when you're managing something you don't want to show. Elara, I'm fine. Too quick. You're not. She let out a breath, sat back down. I've been having, they're probably Braxton Hicks, practice contractions. It's normal. She said it like she was reading from the midwife's handbook, which she probably was, from memory. They've been on and off for a few days. A few days. It's normal. She met his eyes. I know what I'm talking about. He didn't argue with her, but after she went upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the ledger closed in front of him, listening to the sounds of the old house settling in the cold, and he thought about what she'd said. A few days. He thought about 6 weeks early. He thought about the nearest doctor, which was in Doverfield, 12 miles out, and the state of the roads when it snowed, which it was going to snow, possibly soon. He got up and checked the woodpile. Then he went to the barn and made sure the lanterns had oil. Then he went back inside and checked the pantry for things he might be missing that a woman having a baby might need. He didn't know what he was looking for. He didn't find it. He went to bed eventually, but not before pulling the extra blankets from the chest at the foot of his own bed and leaving them folded outside her door. She didn't mention it in the morning. Look, the trouble with Cedric Voss started on a Tuesday in November. Garrick had driven into town to see about getting a buyer interested in the preserved stock. Some of it was ready, the apple butter and the late pear preserves, and he'd had a letter from a merchant in Doverfield who'd heard the Hale orchard was in business again and was interested in terms. He was in a better mood than he'd been in for a while, the kind of mood that felt fragile and a little strange after so long without it. He was coming out of the merchant's office when Voss stepped off the boardwalk in front of him. Cedric Voss was one of those men who'd been called successful for so long he'd started to believe it was a personality trait. He owned the largest spread in the valley, more land than he needed, more workers than he used well, a way of standing that suggested he expected the world to arrange itself around him, and had mostly found that it did. He and Mira Hale had had an ongoing negotiation for years over a strip of land on the eastern boundary that Voss had wanted, and she'd refused to sell. Garrick had inherited that refusal, along with everything else. "Hale!" Voss smiled, the kind of smile that isn't actually warm. "Good to see you out. We were starting to wonder." "Voss, I hear the orchard's coming back around. Good news. Your mother would have been pleased." A pause, calculated. "I also hear you've got a new situation up there. A tenant." Garrick kept his expression neutral. "A worker." Voss tilted his head. "Unmarried woman, carrying a child, living under your roof." He let that sit for a moment, the way you let a bad smell sit so the other person notices it too. "People talk, Garrick. You know how people talk. People talk about everything. They do. And sometimes what they talk about affects business." Voss's voice stayed pleasant, which was somehow worse than if he'd been openly hostile. "I'm just telling you, man to man, what I'm hearing. Some of the buyers, Henderson, the Darby brothers, they're old-fashioned. They care about reputation, about the kind of establishment they're dealing with. Henderson bought 12 bushels of my mother's preserves for 15 years straight. He's not going to stop buying because of who works for me." "Maybe not." Voss adjusted his hat. "But there's also the question of what it looks like. A woman in that condition, no husband. It raises questions about judgment, about character." He let the implication hang in the air between them. "I'm not saying the questions are fair, I'm saying they exist." Garrick looked at him for a moment. He thought about Elara in the East Slope Gravensteins with the picking hook, her face intent, her hands careful. He thought about the cellar with 40 bushels in cold storage. He thought about the kitchen warm for the first time in months and soup on the table and the ledger numbers finally going in the right direction. "I appreciate the concern, Cedric," he said, in a tone that did not suggest appreciation. "I'll keep it in mind." He walked back to his wagon. He didn't tell Elara about the conversation. He told himself it was because there was nothing concrete to tell, no actual threat, just Voss being Voss. He told himself that. He mostly believed it. He started noticing things, though, after that. The way people in town watched him when he came in for supplies, the conversation that stopped when he walked into the feed store, the woman at the dry goods store who'd been friendly with him his whole life, and was now friendly in a slightly different way, a more careful way. Like she was paying attention to something she hadn't paid attention to before. Elara noticed his mood had shifted. She was perceptive in a way that he'd stopped being surprised by. She noticed things from the corner of her eye, caught changes in tone and expression the way a person catches changes in weather. She didn't ask him about it directly. She just started being very careful around him, very even, which paradoxically made it harder to ignore. One night after dinner, she was knitting. She'd found a basket of yarn in the back of a cabinet, his mother's, and had asked him if she could use it, and something about that question, the asking of it, had undone him slightly. She was knitting something small, and she said, without looking up, "If you need me to leave, I can." Garrick was reading, or pretending to read. He looked up. "What?" "I'm not stupid," she said. Her hands kept moving, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. "I know what I look like to people. I know what they say. If it's affecting your business, it's not affecting my business. Not yet." "Elara." She looked up. Her eyes were level, clear, without self-pity. This was a woman who had made herself stop having self-pity because she couldn't afford it. "I don't want to be a liability to you. You took me in when you didn't have to. I've tried to make myself useful. But if the cost of me being here is higher than what I contribute, stop." His voice came out sharper than he intended, and they both went still for a moment. He softened it. "Stop. You're not a liability, and you're not leaving. Not in that condition, not with winter coming. That's not a discussion I'm willing to have." She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring something. Then she looked back at her knitting. "All right," she said. But that night upstairs, she moved her bag from beside the door to a spot closer to it. An inch or two, just close enough that she could grab it faster if she needed to. She told herself it was just habit. The cold came down from the ridge in mid-November with more intention than it had shown in years. Garrick had been through enough winters on this land to know when one meant business and when it was just making noise. This one meant business. He started watching the sky the way you watch something you don't trust. He restocked the woodpile, and then restocked it again, dragging timber from the stand of dead pines at the back of the property that he'd been meaning to clear for 2 years. He checked the barn for gaps. He filled every container he could find with fresh water from the well. Elara did her own preparations more quietly in the kitchen and the cold cellar. He'd see her moving slower than she had been. The baby had dropped. He didn't know the word for it, but he could see the change in how she carried herself, lower, differently balanced. But she didn't stop. She put up the last of the apple butter. She organized the cellar so that what they'd need first was nearest the door. She did something with the dried herbs in the kitchen that he didn't fully understand, but that made the room smell different, cleaner, more like something was ready in there. The contractions were less ignorable now. He knew because he watched her, and she didn't know he watched her. And he saw the moments when she stopped whatever she was doing and pressed her hand flat to her side and breathed carefully through her nose and then continued. He was counting the moments without deciding to count them, and he didn't like what the counting was telling him. "The Braxton Hicks," he said one afternoon. "Are they more regular?" She didn't look surprised that he'd noticed. "Somewhat." "How regular?" "Regular enough." A beat. "Garrick, I'm going to send word to Doverfield, to the doctor, just so he knows to be ready." She was quiet for a moment. "It costs money to—" "I know what it cost." He didn't say it harshly, he just said it. "I'm going to send word." She looked at him for a long time, this woman who asked for almost nothing and who had very specific opinions about when and how she was willing to accept help. Then she nodded. He sent word to Doverfield. He also sent word to a woman in town, Ruth Deakins, who'd helped at enough births to know what she was doing even if she wasn't a doctor. Ruth wrote back to say she could come if she was needed, just to send someone for her. That night the sky turned the particular gray that meant snow, the kind of gray that doesn't have any other meaning, and Garrick brought the lanterns inside from the barn and filled them all. He had a feeling about the next few days. He'd always been right about that kind of feeling. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by Voss's man, who had the good grace to look uncomfortable about it. Garrick read it standing in the doorway of the kitchen, and Elara, at the stove, watched his face change. He folded the letter. He set it on the counter. "What is it?" she asked. "Voss?" He picked the letter up again, turned it over, set it down. "He says he holds a debt against this property, a loan my mother took out 3 years ago, against the bad harvest in '82. He says the note is due." Elara set her spoon down. "Is that legal? Can he—" "The note exists." Garrick's voice was flat. "My mother didn't mention it to me. She probably thought she'd have time to pay it down before. He stopped. "It's a real debt. He has the paperwork." "How much?" He told her. The number sat between them in the warm kitchen like something cold had been brought inside. She didn't say anything for a moment. She stood very still, her hand on the counter, and he could see her doing the arithmetic. She was always doing arithmetic, this woman, always calculating. And her face told him the arithmetic wasn't coming out any better for her than it had for him. "How long did he give you?" she asked. 60 days. But the letter suggests strongly that he'd be willing to renegotiate if we came to a different arrangement. "What arrangement?" Garrick's jaw tightened. "He doesn't spell it out. He doesn't need to." She understood immediately, the eastern strip of land. Voss finally getting what he'd wanted all those years from Mira Hale. Now that there was a lever he could put enough weight on to move her son. "You could sell it," she said, not suggesting he should, just putting it on the table. "No." "Garrick, my mother refused him for 11 years. I'm not selling him that land." He looked at her. "And don't tell me it's just land, because you know it's not just land. You know exactly what it is." She did know. She'd worked this farm long enough to know that the eastern strip ran along the water access that kept the orchard soil viable, and that without it, Voss would have leverage over the farm indefinitely. It was the kind of thing a man like Voss understood perfectly, which was why he'd been trying to get it for 11 years. She nodded. "Then we figure out another way." "I don't know if there is another way. Not in 60 days. She picked her spoon back up, stirred the pot, stared at it. "Let me think," she said. He let her think. He went out to the barn because he needed to move, needed to be doing something with his hands, and he mucked out the stalls and repaired a broken rail and fixed the latch on the gate that had been broken since spring. And by the time he came back in for the midday meal, she had paper and pencil on the kitchen table and a list started. He sat down across from her and she slid the paper toward him. It was the inventory. Every jar in the cold cellar, every bushel in cold storage, every contract he'd mentioned in passing, every buyer whose name had come up, cross-referenced against the debt number and the 60 days and the market prices she'd apparently been tracking in her head all along. "It's close," she said. "If you sell the preserve stock now at end-of-season prices, and if the Doverfield merchant takes the winter delivery terms we talked about," she tapped the page. "It's close. Not certain, but close." He looked at the numbers for a long time. "You were running these in your head," he said, "this whole time." She looked at him steadily. "I needed to know what the farm was worth. Not for me. Just, I needed to know." He wasn't sure entirely that he believed the "not for me" part. Not because she was lying, but because he thought she might not entirely know her own reasons for everything she did. She'd become, and he hadn't let himself think about this too directly, she'd become invested in this place, in the ledger, in whether the numbers went the right way or the wrong way. She cared what happened to the orchard. He wasn't sure she'd intended that. He wasn't sure he'd intended what he felt about it, either. "I'll go to Doverfield tomorrow," he said. "Talk to Henderson in person." She nodded. Then she pulled the paper back and added another line to her list, something about the wine sap storage conditions, already moving on to the next problem. He watched her for a moment. Her head bent over the paper, her left hand flat on the table, fingers spread, the way she rested her hand when she was thinking hard. Outside, the gray sky had gone grayer. The first flakes were beginning to fall. Neither of them looked up. The flakes that had started falling Thursday afternoon were 2 inches on the ground by Friday morning, which in this part of the valley meant nothing yet. A dusting. A warning. The kind of snow that melts off the south-facing rooflines by noon and leaves everything damp and gray and waiting for the real thing. Garrick left for Doverfield before light. Elara heard him go. The barn door, the creak of the wagon, the sound of hooves on frozen ground fading down the lane. And she lay in the dark for a few minutes with her hand on her belly, listening to the house settle around her. The baby had been moving differently for the past 2 days. Not more, not less, but differently. Lower, slower sometimes, and then suddenly urgent, like something shifting into position. She knew what that meant. She'd read about it enough times that she could recite the paragraph from the midwife's handbook word for word. And knowing it clinically did not make it less strange to feel it happening in her own body. She got up. She was always stiff in the mornings now, her hips aching in a way she'd been told to expect and had underestimated anyway. She dressed slowly, laced her boots sitting on the edge of the bed, and went downstairs to light the stove. The kitchen was cold. She got the fire going and put water on and stood close to the stove until her hands warmed up, and then she looked at the paper still on the table from the night before. Her numbers, her inventory, the careful list of what was possible and what wasn't. And she thought about what Garrick was driving toward in Doverfield and whether it was going to be enough. She thought he could do it. Henderson was reasonable, and the preserved stock was quality. And Garrick, when he needed to be, was capable of being persuasive in a quiet, steady way that tended to work on reasonable people. She'd seen it with the workers, seen it with the buyer from Tanner's Mill who'd come out last month skeptical and left with a contract. He didn't oversell. He didn't charm. He just told you what he had and what it was worth and let you figure out that he was right. She hoped it was enough. She poured herself tea and sat with her list and added 2 more items she'd thought of in the night, then folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket out of habit. She'd been keeping track of things in her coat pocket for 4 months, small papers, small plans, and she went to start the day. The morning was quiet in the way that snow mornings are quiet. Everything muffled and close, the sounds from the barn coming clearly through the cold air. She fed the chickens, which required negotiating with the rooster, who had opinions about people entering his space and expressed them loudly. She checked on the dairy cow, Bess, who was placid and smelled like warm hay and pressed her heavy head into Elara's shoulder in a way that was either affectionate or purely practical, and possibly both. She broke the ice on the water trough. She replenished the wood on the back porch. She was carrying an armful of firewood back to the house when the pain hit. Not the practice kind, not the managed, breathe through it, this is normal kind she'd been telling Garrick about. This was different in quality, sharper, more insistent, located differently than the ones before. And it stopped her in the middle of the yard with her arms full of wood and made her stand very still for 30 seconds while her body decided what it was doing. Then it passed. She carried the wood inside. She set it by the stove. She stood at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the wood and took 3 slow breaths. 7.5 months. She did the counting she'd been avoiding doing. Garrick wouldn't be back from Doverfield until evening at the earliest. Ruth Deakins was in town, 12 miles. The nearest farm with anyone on it was the Peterson place, 4 miles down the valley road, and she didn't know the Petersons well enough to know if they'd come. She took another breath. Then she started pulling things from the cabinet. The clean linens she'd set aside 2 weeks ago without telling Garrick why. The kit she'd put together in Millhaven and carried in the bottom of her bag for 3 months. The midwife's handbook, which she knew by memory but wanted physically present anyway. She was not panicking. She was very specifically and intentionally not panicking, which took a certain amount of effort, and she channeled the effort into moving with purpose, getting things where they needed to be, thinking in the practical steps she was good at rather than in the larger picture she couldn't control. The pain came again an hour later, then again 50 minutes after that. She sat at the kitchen table between contractions with the handbook open in front of her, and she did the arithmetic on what the timing meant, and the arithmetic said this was early, but it was real, and real meant she needed to make a decision about what to do. She thought about walking to the Peterson place. 4 miles on a winter road, early labor, alone. She thought about it seriously for about 30 seconds before her body informed her, through another contraction, that walking 4 miles was not a reasonable option. She thought about waiting. Then she did something she hadn't done in 4 months. Since before Millhaven, since before Thomas, since she'd been a different and perhaps more permeable version of herself. She sat in a warm kitchen in someone else's house, and she felt, very clearly and without any way to manage it away, afraid. Not of the pain. She'd expected pain. Afraid of the particular aloneness of this moment, the specific weight of having no one who belonged to her and to whom she belonged, no one whose job it was to be here. She sat with the fear for about a minute. Then she got up and went to make more hot water because there would need to be hot water, and being afraid changed none of the practical requirements of the situation. The afternoon moved slowly. Contractions coming, contractions passing, each one a little more serious than the last. She was not far along yet. She knew enough to know that. But she was going in one direction, and only one direction, and the light outside was starting to go gray-gold the way it went in the late afternoon, and Garrick was not back. She didn't let herself think about why he wasn't back yet. She moved to the parlor where the big hearth was, and put more wood on the fire and arranged the things she'd need and sat in his mother's rocking chair, which was the most comfortable chair in the house, and rocked very slightly, which helped, and tried to think about what came next. The sound she heard first was the horse, not a wagon. Just a horse, moving fast on the lane, and then hooves in the yard, and then boots on the back porch. She heard them taking the steps 2 at a time, and the back door opened hard. "I came back as fast as I could," Garrick said. He was in the doorway of the parlor with snow on his shoulders, and his face carrying something she'd never seen on it before, a taut, stripped-down kind of concern that he wasn't trying to cover up. "The wagon's in town. I left it. How far apart?" She looked at him. Her hands were calm in her lap. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm too, because the practical part of her had taken over completely from the afraid part, and she was grateful for that. "About 45 minutes, maybe a little less now." He nodded. He came into the room and looked at what she'd arranged and then looked at her. "I sent someone for Ruth before I left town. She should be—" "How far back?" "She was getting her things together when I rode out, 2-3 hours." Elara did the math. "That might be fine," she said. "This could take a while yet." "Might be fine isn't good enough." "Garrick." She looked at him steadily. "Sit down. You're dripping on the floor." He looked down at himself, at the snow coming off his coat, and he shrugged the coat off and hung it on the hook by the door and came back and sat in the chair across from her and looked at her with that same taut expression. She thought he looked like a man who had been afraid in the wagon and was now trying to put the fear somewhere useful. "The meeting went well," she said. He blinked. "What? In Doverfield? You said you came back as fast as you could, which means you didn't tell me how it went, and I want to know." He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Yes. Henderson took the winter terms. Full contract." He rubbed the back of his neck. He also mentioned he'd heard the orchard was doing well again, said he was glad. "Good," she said. "That's good. We still need to move fast on the Voss debt." "I know. We'll work that out." She paused, because another contraction was starting, and she put her hands on the chair arms and breathed, and he went very still watching her, and when it passed she said, "It's all right, that was shorter." "It didn't look all right." "I didn't say it felt all right. I said it was all right." She looked at him with an expression that was almost wry. "They're not the same thing." He didn't argue with that. The snow outside had started again in earnest. They could hear it, not quite a sound, more of an absorbed silence, the specific quality of air when precipitation is thick enough to muffle things. The fire in the hearth was good and hot, and the parlor was the warmest room in the house. And for a while they sat across from each other in the firelight, Elara in his mother's rocker, and Garrick in the chair he'd sat in since he was a boy. And she breathed through each contraction, and he watched her do it, and outside the world went white and quiet. He wanted to ask her things. He was aware of this. Aware of it in a way he'd been aware of it for weeks, but had found it easy enough to set aside while there was work to do. Things about where she'd come from and what she'd wanted before the situation she was in became the situation she was in. What she'd been like at 20 before she'd learned to fold herself into this precise, self-contained shape that asked for nothing and prepared for everything. He wanted to know what she'd thought when she pushed open his gate that first day. He wanted to know what she thought now. He didn't ask. This was not the time for any of those questions. Instead, he said, "Tell me what to do. If Ruth doesn't make it in time, tell me exactly what to do." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, but not the inventory paper, a different one, smaller, more written over. She unfolded it and held it out to him. "I wrote this down last week," she said, "just in case." He took it. He read it. She'd written it in clear, orderly handwriting, numbered steps, what to do and in what order and what to watch for. He read it twice and handed it back. "All right," he said. "You're not worried?" "I'm extremely worried." His voice was flat and honest. "But that doesn't change what you just told me." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. "Good. That's the right answer." The hours that followed were not kind. Ruth Deakins arrived just before 9 in the evening, having driven through thickening snow in a wagon that she later described as the worst journey she'd made in 30 years of worst journeys. She was a stout woman in her 50s with rough hands and a voice that carried natural authority, and she took one look at the situation and took charge of it, which was the most relieving thing that happened all night. Garrick was instructed to boil water and stay out of the way, and he did both with absolute efficiency, appearing in the doorway whenever Ruth called for something and disappearing again when she didn't. He was very calm. He had decided to be calm, in the same way Elara had decided not to panic, and he held to it. The baby was born at midnight. It was a girl, and she was small, and she did not cry the way a full-term baby cries. She made a sound, a small, effortful sound, and Ruth did the things that needed to be done quickly and with the practiced efficiency of experience, and Elara, exhausted, wrung out, her face wet, reached for her daughter. Ruth's expression was professional and careful, and told Garrick, when their eyes met over Elara's head, what he needed to know without her having to say it in the room where Elara could hear. The baby was small, too small. She wasn't nursing, she was breathing, but each breath was a little too much work. He went out of the room. He stood in the hallway for a moment, hands at his sides, thinking. Ruth had said, not loudly, not to Elara, just to him in the kitchen an hour ago when she'd stepped out for a moment, that a premature baby this small sometimes didn't have the strength to feed, and that in that case the first hours were critical, and that what the baby needed was warmth and sustenance, and he put his coat on. He took the lantern from the hook in the kitchen. He went out into the storm. The snow was mid-calf now in the yard, the kind of accumulation that happened when a storm had decided it was serious. The wind was coming from the north and the lantern threw its light in a swaying, unreliable arc, and he walked through the snow to the barn, his breath coming hard, not from exertion, but from the specific fear that had moved into the part of his chest where he'd been keeping it all night and was now getting larger and harder to contain. Bess was in her stall, warm, enormous, placid as always. She looked at him with her big brown eyes and moved aside when he went in next to her, and he started talking to her, quiet and low, the way you talk to livestock in the dark because it calms them, or possibly because it calms you and you've convinced yourself it's about them. "You're going to need to come inside," he told her. "I know that's not a normal request." Bess had no obvious objection. Getting a dairy cow through a storm and through a back door that was not designed for dairy cows was, in practical terms, an extended negotiation. He had to widen the opening, which required tools he had to find by lamplight in the barn, and he had to lead her across 60 feet of yard in knee-deep snow, which she accepted with more equanimity than he might have expected. She didn't like the wind. She moved faster than he expected once they were facing the house. She went sideways through the kitchen door and stood in the kitchen with snow on her back looking at the stove. Ruth came out of the parlor and stopped. She stared at the cow. She stared at Garrick. Then she said practically, "We'll need a clean bucket." He found a clean bucket. The rest of that night he did not think about clearly, even afterward. It existed in his memory as a series of images without connecting tissue. The firelight in the parlor, the sound of the storm against the windows, Ruth's competent hands, Elara's exhausted face, the baby wrapped and small and breathing, the bucket of warm milk, and the patience required to get a newborn to take it. Drop by drop from a cloth because she was too weak to do anything else. His hands in all of it, doing what he was told, steady because he had decided to be steady. At some point before dawn, the baby's breathing changed. Easier, not struggling in the same way. Ruth looked at the baby and then looked at Garrick, and something shifted slightly in her professional expression. "Get some sleep," she told him. "I've got them." He didn't get sleep. He sat in the hall outside the parlor with his back against the wall and his arms on his knees and his eyes closed, and he listened to the sounds inside the room. Elara's voice, low and soft, talking to the baby in the way new mothers talk, not quite sentences, just sound and warmth. And outside the storm battered the house, and the windows held, and the walls held, and everything held. He thought about his mother's orchard, his orchard. He thought about what held and what didn't, and why. And he thought about the woman in the parlor who had come through his gate with a bag on her shoulder and an offer he'd almost refused, and he thought about all the ways this winter could have gone differently. He didn't let himself finish the thought. By morning, the snow was still falling. The roads were buried. Doverfield was unreachable. Town was unreachable. The world had narrowed down to this farm, these acres, this house with its warm kitchen and its creaking floors and its two women, one exhausted and one barely arrived, and its impossible cow standing in the kitchen eating hay from a pile Garrick had brought in from the barn at 3 a.m. because she'd started looking at the walls with a speculative expression. Ruth slept in the chair in the parlor. Elara slept with the baby on her chest, one hand curved around the small, warm weight of her. Garrick checked the woodpile. He fed the stove. He fed Bess. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the white world outside and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A feeling he didn't have a clean name for, something adjacent to being needed and adjacent to being afraid, and not quite either one. The baby slept. The storm didn't stop, but it didn't get worse. And Garrick Hale stood in his kitchen with a cow and a lantern and the particular silence of a house where something new had just arrived, and he waited for morning to become what it was going to be. The storm broke on the third day. Not gently. It didn't ease off or thin out gradually the way some storms did, giving you time to adjust. It just stopped, the way a held breath stops, and left behind a silence so complete that Garrick woke up before dawn and lay in bed listening to nothing and couldn't place, for a moment, what was wrong. Then he realized. The wind. It was gone. He got up and went to the window, and the world outside was white and still and enormous. The kind of landscape that makes the distances between things feel longer than they are. The orchard rows were soft mounds. The lane was buried to the fence posts. Somewhere under all of it were the roads to town, to Doverfield, to every other place that had existed before the storm decided none of that mattered for a while. He dressed and went downstairs. Elara was already awake. This was not a surprise. She had barely slept in 3 days, not in any real way, sleeping in short pieces that lasted until the baby woke or until something in her own body pulled her back to alertness. She was in the rocking chair by the parlor fire with the baby on her chest, and she looked up when he came to the doorway. She looked like someone who had been through something serious and was on the other side of it, but hadn't had time yet to understand what the other side felt like. The baby was asleep. Even from the doorway, he could see the small chest rising and falling in the steady, deliberate rhythm that had become the thing everyone in the house measured everything else against. "Storm's done," he said quietly. "I heard it stop." She shifted slightly, adjusting the baby's weight. "How's the lane?" "Buried. Day's work to clear it. Maybe more." She nodded. She looked at the fire for a moment. "Ruth needs to get home. She has her own family." "I know. I'll start on the lane after I do the barn." He did the barn first. The animals needed tending regardless of roads, and then spent the better part of the morning with a shovel on the lane. It was hard work, the snow heavy and wet now that the temperature had come up a few degrees, and he went at it steadily and without rushing because rushing this kind of work got you nowhere. He was about halfway done when he heard runners on the lane behind him and turned to find Tom Peterson coming in with his horse and a wide blade mounted on the front of his sledge. "Heard you had some trouble," Peterson said, pulling up. "Word travels. Ruth Deakins told half the valley before she got her coat off, I expect." Peterson looked at the lane and then at the blade on his sledge. "Move aside." It took another hour with both of them working and Peterson's blade helping, and by midday the lane was clear enough for a wagon to get through carefully. Ruth Deakins left after lunch, pressing Elara's hand for a long moment before she went, saying something too low for Garrick to hear. Whatever it was made Elara close her eyes briefly and nod. Peterson stayed for coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Bess, who was still technically in the kitchen because nobody had made a firm decision about moving her back to the barn yet. "That's a cow," Peterson said. "It is," Garrick agreed. Peterson drank his coffee. "How'd she do with the baby?" "Fine. Good, actually." He paused. "She's been good about the whole thing." Peterson nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected about the nature of cows. He finished his coffee and left, and Garrick finally moved Bess back to the barn, where she returned to her stall with the air of someone who had completed a difficult assignment and expected to be acknowledged for it. The days after the storm had a different quality than the days before it. Something had shifted in the house. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but the way light shifts when clouds move, the same rooms looking subtly different. Part of it was the baby, who changed everything she was in proximity to simply by existing and requiring things. Part of it was something else that neither Garrick nor Elara was in any hurry to examine. He gave her space. He understood, or thought he understood, that what she needed right now was not conversation or questions or any new thing to think about. What she needed was warmth and food and the chance to sit with her daughter without anyone making demands on her attention. He kept the fire going, he kept food on the stove, he kept the house running the way she'd organized it, which turned out to be not that hard because she'd organized it sensibly. He learned where things went because she'd put them where they made sense to be. She named the baby Clara. She told him this on the 4th day after the birth, saying it matter-of-factly while she was sitting at the kitchen table with Clara in her lap and a cup of tea going cold beside her. "Clara," she said, "I've been thinking about it since before she was born." He was at the stove with his back to her. He stopped what he was doing for a moment. "That's a good name." "It was my grandmother's name." He thought about the grandmother she'd mentioned before, the one with the kitchen garden and the cold cellar who'd kept 12 people fed through 3 bad winters. He thought it was a good name to give forward. Clara was small. She was going to be small for a long time, the way premature babies are, measuring out their progress in smaller increments than babies who'd had the full time they needed. She had Elara's coloring and a quality of alertness, even this young, that made you feel she was paying attention to things with more intention than a newborn reasonably should. Elara watched her with an intensity that was almost frightening in its focus, checking her breathing, checking her color, checking the warmth of her hands and feet with the same methodical attention she brought to everything she cared about. Garrick watched Elara watch her daughter and thought, she would burn the world down for this baby. The thought arrived without drama and without any particular destination, just as a fact he was registering about the person in his kitchen. On the 6th day after the storm, he drove to town. He'd been putting it off, which was not like him, but he knew what was waiting in town and he hadn't wanted to deal with it while everything else was happening. He parked the wagon on the main street and went first to the post office, where there was a letter waiting for him. Another one from Voss, shorter than the first, reminding him of the 60-day timeline, which had now become 54 days, in the particular tone of a man who enjoys counting. He read it standing on the street and then put it in his coat pocket and went to the bank. The conversation at the bank was not encouraging. He'd known it wouldn't be. The manager, a careful man named Ellis, who'd known Garrick's family for years and was apologetic about it, went through the numbers with him, and the conclusion was the same one Elara's inventory list had almost reached. Close, but not certain, not without something additional. He came out of the bank and stood on the street for a moment, squinting at the winter light on the snow. Across the street, he could see the window of the dry goods store where, according to Elara, the woman who'd told her about the orchard had been standing. He thought about that. He thought about Elara hearing that conversation and making the calculation to come and knock on his gate. A woman who had nothing left but her knowledge and her willingness to work and the particular determination of someone who has stopped waiting to be saved. He thought about what it would mean to lose the orchard. Not just the money, not just the land. The rows his mother had planted herself, some of them, the ones along the north fence that took 10 years to come to proper bearing, and that she'd talked about with a pride she didn't apply to many other things. The cold cellar she'd built with his father before Garrick was born. The eastern strip of land that Voss had been circling for 11 years like something he was owed. He went to see Ellis again. He was in there for 40 minutes. When he came out, his face was set in a way that meant he'd made a decision and was not interested in reconsidering it, and he drove home with the particular quiet of a man who has used up most of his available choices and is at peace with the one remaining. He told Elara that night. Clara was asleep in the basket he'd patted and set near the hearth, the closest thing to a proper cradle that the house had until he could get to a carpenter. Elara was at the kitchen table with her tea, and she was looking better than she had. Still tired, always tired, the kind of tired that doesn't resolve in days, but more herself, the particular self-containedness coming back into her posture. He sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "I paid the debt." She looked up. "What?" "Voss's note. I paid it this afternoon. Full amount." She stared at him. "Garrick, you said we were close, but not. I took a loan against next season's projected yield." Ellis wasn't enthusiastic, but he did it. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "It cleaned me out, more or less. What's in the cold cellar is what we have until the spring contracts come through. But the debt's paid and Voss doesn't have a note against this property anymore." She was quiet for a long time. She was doing the arithmetic, he knew, running the numbers the way she always did, calculating what he'd done and what it left and what it meant. And he waited because he'd learned that waiting for her to finish thinking was more productive than trying to talk over it. "You should have talked to me first," she said. "I know. We could have." "There wasn't another option that didn't take longer than we had." He looked at her steadily. "He was going to move on the property before we could put together a better answer. I knew that from the letter, so I moved first." She held his gaze. Her expression was complicated in a way he'd learned to read a little, not anger exactly, something more layered. Frustration that she hadn't been consulted, awareness that he was probably right, discomfort at being on the receiving end of someone else's sacrifice. She didn't like that part. He'd already understood that about her. "It's my situation that put you in a harder position," she said. "It's Voss that put me in a harder position. You didn't do that." He said it simply, not to reassure her, just because it was true and he wanted it to be clear. "You've been holding this place together since October. What's in that cellar is what you built. Don't sit here and tell me you're a liability." She looked away from him. She looked at Clara in the basket by the hearth, at the small sleeping face, the hands curled against her cheeks. Something moved across her own face, something she couldn't quite get hold of before it passed, something tender and exhausted and not entirely settled. "He's going to come back," she said. "Voss? When he finds out he lost the leverage." "Yes." He won't be polite about it. Probably not. She was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Same thing I've been doing. Run the orchard. Sell what we have. Make the spring contracts work. A pause. What are you going to do? She looked at him again, and he saw the question land the way he'd meant it to. Not as pressure, just as a real question, a question she'd been not answering since she got here, and that he was now gently putting in front of her. She didn't answer it directly, but she picked up her tea and she didn't look toward the door, and that was something. The weeks that followed were the quietest of the winter. Not easy. Nothing about this period was easy, with an infant in the house and money tighter than it had ever been in Garrick's memory, and the specter of Voss's eventual response sitting at the edge of everything. But quiet in the way that deep winter is quiet, when the urgency of the harvest is over and the urgency of spring hasn't started yet. And there is, for a strange brief interval, just the present. Clara grew. Slowly, in the way she did everything, but steadily. She was sleeping longer stretches by the third week, eating better, making the sounds that babies make when things are going in the right direction. Color in her cheeks, a grip on Elara's finger that was becoming something you could actually feel. Garrick held her twice in those first weeks, both times at Elara's suggestion, both times with the particular careful awkwardness of a man who hadn't held an infant in years and wasn't sure his hands remembered how. Clara looked up at him from the crook of his arm with the unfocused alertness she'd arrived with, and he looked back and neither of them knew what to make of the other. He found himself listening for her in the night, not lying awake waiting, just attuned, the way you get attuned to the sounds of a house, so that a change in those sounds registers. Clara's sounds had become part of the house's sounds. He didn't examine this too carefully. Voss came on a Tuesday in February, not with a letter this time, in person, which was worse. He came in the mid-morning when Garrick was in the barn and Elara was in the kitchen with Clara, and Garrick saw the horse from the barn window and came out and stood in the yard to meet him, making sure the meeting happened outside. Voss dismounted slowly, the way a man dismounts when he's arranging his expression while he does it. He looked at Garrick, and then looked at the house, and then looked at the orchard, and Garrick saw him registering the things that were different from what he'd expected. The wood neatly stacked, the barn in good repair, the lane clear and marked, the general sense of a property that was being managed rather than failing. "I hear you settled the note," Voss said. "I did." A pause. "That was faster than I expected." "Apparently." Garrick's voice was even. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides and his expression neutral in the particular way he'd been neutral with Voss since November, a neutrality that contained more than it showed. Voss looked at the house again. "She's still here. Her name is Elara Whitlock. She works this farm." "Garrick!" Voss shifted his weight, and the pleasantness dropped out of his voice. "Not all the way, but enough. I've known you your whole life. I knew your mother. I'm trying to help you see what this looks like." "You've been trying to help me see what things look like since October. I appreciate the concern." He let a moment pass. "The debt is paid, Cedric. Whatever you were hoping that note would accomplish, it's done." Voss looked at him. He looked at the orchard, at the long rows of bare trees under the winter sky, gray and quiet and waiting for March. He looked like a man revising his calculations and not enjoying it. "The eastern strip," he said. "Straight out, no more dressing it up." "Not for sale." "I'll pay a fair price. More than fair." "Not for sale." Same tone, same patience. "It wasn't for sale when my mother was alive, and it's not for sale now. That won't change." Voss was quiet for a moment. He had a particular way of being quiet that communicated he was making you wait for something, and Garrick stood in his yard in the February cold and waited for whatever it was. "You're making a mistake," Voss said finally. "The woman, the situation, you should leave." Garrick said it without heat, without particular feeling. Just said it the way you say a fact. "We don't have anything more to talk about." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, something more like recalculation. The look of a man who has arrived at a situation from one angle and is now trying to find the other angles. Then he put his hat back on and mounted his horse. He rode down the lane without looking back. Garrick stood in the yard until he was gone. Then he went inside. Elara was at the kitchen table with Clara in her lap, and she looked up when he came in and read his face the way she read everything, quickly and accurately. "Well," she said, "he's gone. For now." "For now," he agreed. He sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the rough skin and the calluses, his father's hands, the kind of hands that come from this kind of work. "He'll think of something else. He's that kind of man." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "But you held." He looked up. "You held," she said again, simply. She wasn't making a speech about it. She was just saying what had happened and what it meant, the way she said most things. Clara made a small sound, and Elara shifted her automatically, her attention moving to her daughter with that immediate, total quality it always had. Garrick got up and poured himself coffee and stood at the window for a while, watching the lane where Voss's horse had gone, watching the road that led away from here into the valley, and the town, and whatever Voss was thinking on his ride home. Behind him, Clara made another sound, louder, with more intention, and Elara said, all right, I hear you," in the low, patient voice she used with the baby, and there was the small, familiar shuffle of them settling, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the February light was pale and cold, and the orchard stood in it exactly as it always had, bare and dormant and entirely intact. He didn't feel like he'd won anything. That wasn't the right word for it. He felt like the line had held, like the thing that mattered had stayed where it was supposed to be. That was enough for right now. What he didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, sitting in that kitchen in the tail end of winter, Voss's dust settling on the lane, and Clara making her small demanding sounds and the cold cellar holding what it held, was that the hardest part wasn't Voss. The hardest part wasn't the debt or the storm or the birth or any of the things that could be measured and planned for and managed through with enough stubbornness and enough work. The hardest part was what happened when all those things were over, when there was nothing left to survive and you had to figure out what you were instead. March came in cold and left warm, the way it sometimes did in this valley, like it had somewhere better to be and picked up the pace toward the end. The snow went off the fields in stages. First the south-facing slopes, then the flat ground, then finally the shaded places along the north fence, where it had drifted deepest and held longest. The orchard rows emerged from under it the way they always did, muddy and bare, and somehow more themselves for having been covered, the old bark dark with moisture, the branch tips showing the first faint blush of bud that you had to look closely to see, but that was there, if you looked. Garrick looked. Every morning, first pass through the rows, he checked the buds. He'd been doing it since he was 7 years old, his mother's hand on his shoulder, her voice in his ear telling him what he was seeing. He still heard it sometimes, walking those rows. He thought he always would. Elara started coming out with him in the mornings once Clara was sleeping long enough to leave her for an hour. She didn't say she wanted to come. She just appeared one morning in her coat, with her hands in her pockets while he was lacing his boots. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and he handed her the thicker pair of gloves from the hook by the door without either of them making a point of it. They walked the rows together, and she asked the same question she'd been asking since October. Practical questions. Things she wanted to know because knowing them was useful. Which varieties budded first, what the blossom sequence told you about the timing of the harvest, where the frost pockets were in the low ground that you had to watch in late April when a cold snap could still take a whole row overnight if you weren't paying attention. He told her. She listened the way she listened to everything, with the full attention of someone who intends to remember. They were coming back along the east slope one morning, the sun just getting high enough to take the chill off, when she stopped and stood looking out over the valley. The view from the eastern slope was the best view on the property. You could see the whole valley laid out below, the other farms, the thread of the river, the town just visible through the bare trees. His mother had loved this spot. He'd never told anyone that. "I've been thinking," Elara said. "About what?" She kept looking at the valley for a moment. "About staying." He didn't say anything. He waited. "Not forever, necessarily. Or, I don't know. I don't know what I mean by it." She turned and looked at him, and her face was doing that complicated thing it did when she was saying something she'd worked herself up to say. "I mean that I've been thinking about it, that I want to think about it, rather than not thinking about it, which is what I've been doing." He considered that. "Your bag's still by the door." She looked at him sharply, a little caught. "I know." "Closer to the door than it was in January," he said. not accusatory, just noting it. She looked away again, the valley, the river, the morning light on the bare hillside across from them. Habits take time to break. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I just want you to know that the room is yours, not because of the harvest or the work or any of that. It's yours because I'm offering it. He paused. That's different from before. She turned back to look at him, and he held her gaze and didn't look away from it. And something moved between them in the cold March morning air, something that had been building since October and that neither of them had been willing to call by its real name. She nodded. Once, small. All right, she said. They walked back to the house. He didn't ask her to move the bag. She didn't move it that day. But it was something, that morning on the eastern slope. Something that had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and they both knew it, and they both went back to work. The spring contracts came in better than he'd projected. Henderson expanded his order. 2 other merchants from Doverfield made contact after hearing that the Hale orchard was in serious operation again, and one of them wanted a standing monthly order for preserved goods starting in April, which was the kind of contract his mother had built the farm's stability on, and that he hadn't had since before she got sick. He drove to Doverfield twice in March to sign papers, and both times came home with numbers that, when he sat down with the ledger in the evening, looked better than the ones on the same pages from 3 years ago. He showed Elara the ledger. He hadn't planned to. He just set it on the table one night and turned it so she could read it, and she looked at the numbers for a while without speaking, her finger moving along the columns, and then she said, "That's April through October, plus the December preserved goods order?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "The loan against the spring yield. Covered by the Henderson contract alone. The rest is margin." She looked up at him. "You're not in trouble anymore. Not like we were." He closed the ledger. "We're not comfortable. But the thing that was going to take the farm is gone." She sat back. She looked at the table, at her hands. He thought she might say something about leaving again, about the situation being different now, about not needing to stay. He'd been half expecting it, had been preparing for it in the back of his mind the way you prepare for a thing you don't want to think about directly. She didn't say it. She picked up her tea and looked at the wall and said, "The late wine saps on the western slope. The soil's still too acid. If you're planning to bring those rows to full yield, you need to start amending it this spring, or you lose another season." He looked at her. She looked back at him, calm, practical, that particular steadiness in her eyes. "I know how to do it," she said. "If you want." He let out a breath. "Yes," he said. "I want." Clara was 4 months old in March and had opinions about the world that she was increasingly able to express. She had a voice that was loud relative to her size, and she used it without restraint when something displeased her, which Elara bore with more patience than Garrick might have managed, and which seemed to entertain the farm's workers to no end. The 2 men who came on in March to help with the spring preparation, brothers named Will and Foster Gant, who'd worked the orchard 3 seasons ago before things went bad and had come back when word got around that Hale's was running again, took to Clara with an enthusiasm that surprised Garrick and touched Elara in a way she didn't show directly, but that he could see. Will Gant was 22 and unmarried and spent the first week finding excuses to come to the kitchen door at hours that happened to coincide with Clara being awake. Elara found this both transparent and harmless and started leaving the door open in the mornings so he didn't have to knock. "She's going to have that boy completely managed before she's a year old," Garrick said one evening, watching Will through the kitchen window as he made exaggerated faces at Clara on the back porch. "She already does," Elara said. There was laughter in her voice, not the careful, measured expression she'd arrived with, not the controlled pleasantness she'd used while she was still figuring out what this place was and what she was allowed to feel about it. Just laughter, brief and real, and then she was back to whatever she was doing at the stove, but the sound of it stayed in the kitchen for a while after. He thought about it later. He thought about it more than he probably should have. He worked the Western Slope Soil Amendment with her over 3 days in late March, the 2 of them and the Gant brothers hauling lime and compost from the barn and working it into the rows with forks while the soil was soft enough from the melt to turn easily. It was hard work, the kind that left you wrung out by the evening, and Elara did it at a pace that he had long since stopped being surprised by and that the Gant brothers had not yet adjusted to. On the second day, Foster Gant, who was 30 and had worked farms his whole life, and was not a man who made comments about what women could or couldn't do, said to Garrick quietly, "Where'd you find her?" "She found me," Garrick said. Foster considered this. "Lucky for you." Garrick didn't answer that, but he thought about it while they worked, the even sound of the forks in the soil and the cold, sweet smell of turned earth in the early spring air. And he thought about the gate with the rusted hinge and the woman who'd pushed it open and stood there with her bag on her shoulder. And he thought, yes, lucky for me. Though that wasn't the whole of what he felt, not even close, and the rest of it didn't have as simple a word. The gossip from town had not entirely stopped. He'd been prepared for that. Voss had been talking, was almost certainly still talking, and the town was a place where talking moved faster than any other form of transportation. But the nature of it had shifted. In November, the talk had been suspicious, even hostile, the kind of social pressure Voss had been counting on to work on Garrick the way a lever works on a stone. By March, it was something different. The orchard's recovery was visible and undeniable, and visible, undeniable things have a way of changing conversations. He heard it from Peterson, who came by occasionally and had that particular quality of a man who keeps his ear to the ground without making a performance of it. "People are watching the orchard," Peterson told him one afternoon over coffee, Clara making her considerable presence known from the basket near the window. "They're remembering what it was like when your mother was running it full out, when there was work here and decent prices and the kind of place that kept the valley healthy." He paused. "Some of them feel bad about how they treated the woman when she came through in October. Some of them. The ones with any sense." Peterson drank his coffee. "Voss isn't getting the traction he used to. People don't listen to a man complain about someone else's prosperity when they'd like a little themselves." Garrick thought about that. He thought about Elara walking 31 doors in one morning, and what each of those closed doors had cost a woman who didn't let things cost her anything she could avoid. He thought about whether he was supposed to be pleased that the town's opinion was improving now that the situation was easier to have an opinion about, and he found he wasn't particularly pleased. You didn't get credit, in his view, for deciding someone deserved decency once they'd already proved they could do without it. He didn't say any of this to Elara. Some things you keep because saying them serves no purpose except making yourself feel righteous. And he didn't have much patience for that particular feeling. What he did do, in the second week of April, was drive to town and have a quiet conversation with Ellis at the bank about something he'd been thinking about since March. A legal question that Ellis referred him to an attorney named Marsh, who had an office above the hardware store. He came back from that conversation with some papers and a lot to think about, and he sat on it for a week before he did anything with it. The blossoms opened in the third week of April. It happened the way it always did, suddenly and everywhere at once, the way the orchard seemed to wait until you weren't watching and then committed entirely. One morning you walked the rows and the buds were tight, and the next you came out and the trees were full of white and pale pink, and the smell of it was something you couldn't describe to someone who hadn't stood in an orchard in blossom at 8 in the morning with cold air still on the ground and the sun just coming over the ridge. Garrick was standing in the center row looking at all of it when he heard Elara come through the gate behind him. She stopped when she saw the blossoms. She stood still for a moment, Clara against her chest in the sling she'd rigged from a length of cloth, Clara's small dark-haired head just visible at Elara's collarbone. She stood still and looked at the trees, and her face was open in a way it rarely was outside, unguarded, taking in something too large to manage into a smaller feeling. "I've never seen an orchard in full bloom," she said. He hadn't known that. He thought about all the things he didn't know about her, all the places she'd been before this one, all the versions of herself she'd had to be before the one standing in his orchard looking at the blossoms. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the good rows." They walked the whole orchard that morning, Clara bobbing gently in the sling, Elara asking questions and touching the bark of the trees with her free hand the way she touched everything she wanted to understand. He told her what each variety would bring in August and September, which ones had been there since his grandfather's time, and which his mother had put in herself, where the yield was strong and where they were still rebuilding. She listened, but differently than she'd listened in October, differently than she'd listened all winter. She wasn't cataloging information for practical use. She was just listening. Listening like someone who intended to remember this specifically, this morning, this conversation, and not because it was useful. He noticed. That afternoon, he sat down at his mother's desk with the papers from the attorney and looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up his pen. He didn't finish the papers that day. He put them in the desk drawer and closed it, and went out to help the Gant brothers with the first of the spring spraying, which needed 2 people on the pump and 1 guiding the nozzle. And he worked until the light went and came in for dinner and sat across from Elara at the table where they'd been sitting across from each other since October. Clara was in her basket. She'd started sleeping better, longer stretches through the evening, which meant dinner was increasingly a meal eaten at a reasonable pace rather than in the intervals between demands. Elara had made the kind of dinner she made when she wasn't trying to demonstrate anything. Plain food, good, the kind that used what was here. They ate and the conversation went the way it went. Practical things first, the spray schedule, the graphs he was planning for the North Row, whether the late frost threat had passed. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She set her fork down. She looked at him with the directness she reserved for things she'd decided to say and was going to say regardless of how they landed. "When I first came here, that first morning, why did you let me stay?" He thought about it honestly. "My mother would have," he said. "That's the first part. And the second part?" He looked at her. "You were already working. Before I said yes, you were in the rows sorting fruit that nobody else had bothered with." He paused. "I don't know. I thought, somebody who works like that in that condition, because she's decided something is worth saving, that's someone worth letting stay." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were going to say you felt sorry for me." "I did feel sorry for you." "Garrick, that's not the same thing. I felt sorry for the situation. I didn't think you needed my pity, and I didn't offer it." He picked up his fork again. "There's a difference." She looked at him steadily, and then something shifted in her face, small and real, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Yes," she said, "there is." They finished dinner. Elara did the dishes, and Garrick checked on the barn, and when he came back in, she was at the table with Clara awake in her lap, the baby gripping her finger and examining it with the serious concentration that was increasingly her resting expression. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Elara." She looked up. He wasn't sure, quite, how to say what he wanted to say. He'd been working on it for a while. Since March, really, since the eastern slope that morning, when she'd said she'd been thinking about staying, since before that, if he was being honest. And what he'd landed on was not eloquent, but it was true. "I went to see Marsh, the attorney in town," he said, "a few weeks ago." She waited. "The farm's—" There's a question of the arrangement. What it is, legally, what it should be. He stopped, aware he was not saying this well. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you I've been thinking about it. About what would make sense, about what's fair for you and for Clara." She looked at him for a long time. Clara, oblivious to the weight of the moment, continued examining her mother's finger. "Are you talking about a formal arrangement?" Elara said carefully. "Or are you talking about something else?" "Both, maybe." He held her gaze. "I'm talking about whatever makes you feel like you don't have to keep the bag by the door." The words sat between them in the warm kitchen. Clara made a small sound of satisfaction about the finger. Outside, the April evening was going blue, and the orchard was full of blossoms, and the first peepers had started down by the creek, the first sign every year that the season had genuinely turned. Elara looked down at her daughter. She looked at the room, the kitchen she'd reorganized and learned and made workable again, the walls she'd watched change from strange to familiar over these months. She looked at her hands. She didn't answer right away. He hadn't expected her to. She was not a person who answered things before she'd finished thinking them through, and he'd stopped wanting her to be different from what she was a long time ago. "Let me think about it," she said. "All right." She looked up, and there was something in her face. Not the closed door he'd seen in October when things got too close to the things she was protecting, but something open. Careful still, guarded still, but open in the way that a window is open even when you're not quite ready to go through it. "Thank you," she said. "For asking." He nodded. He went to check the fire. She stayed at the table with Clara, and the evening settled around the house the way spring evenings do. Slowly, gently, with the peepers going in the creek and the blossoms cooling in the dark, and the smell of the orchard coming in through the cracked kitchen window. The bag was still by the door that night, but she'd moved it back, without deciding to, 6 inches from where it had been that morning. Neither of them noticed. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks. That was Elara's way. She didn't make decisions quickly, and she didn't make them out loud. And if you pushed her toward a conclusion before she'd finished reaching it herself, she'd pull back to wherever she'd started. Not out of stubbornness exactly, but out of some deep-seated conviction that the only choices worth making were ones you'd fully examined from every angle, including the angles that scared you. Garrick had come to understand this. He'd asked his question, and he'd meant it, and now he left it alone, which was the only correct thing to do with Elara Whitlock when she was thinking. May came in warm. The blossoms had gone to fruit, small, hard, green, the size of marbles. And the orchard had that full summer look, leaves out everywhere, the rows shaded in the way they'd be until October. The Gant brothers were on full schedule. A third worker, an older man named Cass, who'd been farming this valley for 40 years, and who communicated mostly in grunts that Garrick had learned to interpret, came on for the thinning work. The farm had a pulse again. You could feel it walking the rows, the sense of something being tended, something being worked toward. Clara was 5 months old and had the personality of someone who had decided on strong opinions and wasn't planning to soften them for anyone. She was alert and demanding, and when she was pleased, she showed it with the full force of her small self, a smile that used her whole face. And when she was displeased, she let that be known too, at volume, with no apparent concern for the social consequences. Elara looked at her sometimes with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and helpless recognition, the look of a woman seeing something of herself and not being entirely sure how to feel about that. "She's going to be trouble," Will Gant said cheerfully one morning, making faces at Clara over the porch railing. "She's already trouble," Elara said. "Takes after you then," Garrick said, not looking up from the sprayer he was adjusting. There was a pause. "Is that so?" Elara said. He looked up. Her expression was somewhere between offended and amused, and trying not to be either. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the sprayer. Will Gant found something urgent to do on the other side of the barn. That was May. That was what May was like that year, on that farm. Work and warmth, and the orchard filling in, and Clara getting heavier and more vocal, and the 3 weeks of Elara's thinking moving quietly under everything, like water under ice. Voss came back in the second week of May, not in person this time. A letter, delivered through an attorney, which told Garrick that Voss had spent the winter doing something more organized than complaining. The letter was formal and careful, and what it said, under the legal language, was this. Voss claimed that a portion of the eastern boundary fence had been incorrectly surveyed 30 years ago, and that the true property line placed approximately 40 feet of the eastern slope inside his land, not the Hale orchards. He was not demanding anything yet. He was, in the language of the letter, merely raising the matter for consideration. Garrick read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He set it down. Elara read it once. She set it down. They looked at each other. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No." "The survey. Is he right? Is it possible? My mother had the property surveyed in 1879. I have the documents." He tapped the letter. "He knows that. He's not doing this because he thinks he'll win a survey dispute. He's doing it because a dispute takes time and money, and he's betting we don't have enough of either." She was quiet for a moment. "Do we?" He thought about it honestly. "The time, yes. The money." He paused. "Marsh will know what this costs to defend. It won't be nothing." "What does Marsh say? Have you talked to him?" "I'll go this afternoon." She nodded. She looked at the letter again, at Voss's attorney's careful formal language, and he could see her doing what she always did with problems, breaking it apart, finding the edges, looking for the place where pressure could be applied usefully. "The 1879 survey," she said. "Where is it?" "My mother's files, the cabinet in the study." She was already standing up. He found her in the study 20 minutes later, the cabinet open, folders spread on the desk with Clara in the sling on her chest. The baby apparently content for the moment to observe her mother work through whatever this was. Elara had the survey document open, and she was reading it with the focused attention she brought to anything she considered important, her finger moving along the lines. "The eastern boundary marker," she said without looking up. "It references a stone wall and a standing oak tree. Is that wall still there?" "Most of it." "Is the oak still there?" He thought about it. "I think so. There's an old oak on that boundary. It's been there as long as I can remember. She looked up. Then his claim fails before it starts. The survey references fixed landmarks that still exist. Any resurvey would find the same line. She set the document down. He's hoping you don't know that, or that you'll spend money proving it before you figure it out. Garrick looked at her. She looked back at him with the matter-of-fact steadiness that he'd stopped finding surprising and had started finding something else. Something he carried around in his chest that didn't have a name he was willing to give it out loud yet. Go see Marsh anyway, she said, but take that document with you. He took the document. Marsh confirmed in the measured tones of a man who'd seen this particular kind of maneuver before, that Voss's claim was weak and that the existing survey landmarks made it weaker. He also said something else, something he said with the careful neutrality of a man conveying information without inserting opinion, that Voss had been speaking to two of Garrick's regular buyers, and that at least one of them had been made uncomfortable by whatever Voss had said. Garrick drove home with all of this and sat with it. And that evening, after dinner, he said to Elara, Henderson may pull back. She set down her cup. How certain? Not certain, but Voss got to him. He told her what Marsh had said. He watched her face while he talked. She listened without interrupting, without reacting visibly, the way she received hard news, by getting very still. When he finished, she said, What did Voss tell him? Marsh doesn't know exactly, but Henderson's old-fashioned and Voss would know what to say to an old-fashioned man. She was quiet. He could see what she was thinking. He'd gotten better at reading her silences, the particular quality of each one. This one had something heavy in it, something that wasn't just the business problem. He knew what it was. This was the thing that had been true since October. The way her presence here was, in certain quarters, a thing that could be used against the farm. She'd known it since Voss started talking in November, and she'd tried to leave over it once, and Garrick had stopped her, and now here it was again, a real and concrete threat. A buyer who might actually walk. I should go to Henderson, she said. Elara, not to apologize for being here, to talk to him about the farm. She looked at him steadily. I know what he's been told. I know what kind of picture Voss has painted, and I know that the only thing that changes a picture is seeing the thing itself. She paused. Let me go talk to him. He wanted to argue. He sat with the impulse and then let it go, because she was right, and he knew she was right, and the impulse to protect her from it was his impulse, not something she needed. I'll come with you, he said. Yes, she said. You will. They drove to Doverfield on a Thursday, Clara with them because there was no other option. Clara, who was not at her best on wagon rides and made this known clearly for the first 40 minutes until she exhausted herself and went to sleep against Elara's shoulder. Henderson's office was above his warehouse on the main street of Doverfield, a city man's office with a city man's furniture, and Henderson himself was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s who had the look of someone who'd been doing business long enough to have seen most of what business could throw at a person. He stood when they came in. He looked at Elara. He looked at Clara, asleep in the sling. He looked at Garrick. He gestured at the chairs across from his desk. Elara sat down, settled Clara, and looked at Henderson with the same directness she brought to everything. She didn't open with pleasantries. Mr. Henderson, I understand someone has been speaking to you about the Hale orchard and the people running it. Henderson's expression was careful. I've heard some things. I imagine you have. She folded her hands in her lap. Clara's sleeping weight was against her chest. I'm not going to ask you what you were told or try to argue against it point by point. I'm going to tell you what I know, which is the orchard. You can decide what matters to you. She talked for 15 minutes. Not about herself, not about her circumstances, not about Thomas Calloway or the closed doors or the desperate October morning that had brought her to Garrick's gate. She talked about the farm, the 40 bushels in cold storage that had come from a harvest that was rotting on the ground when she arrived, the preserved goods contracts, the soil amendment on the western slope, and what the yield projection looked like for August, the spring blossom count, and what it suggested about the fall harvest. She talked about it with the precision of someone who had been watching every number and every variable for 7 months, and the precision was its own argument. Henderson listened. His expression shifted once, almost imperceptibly, somewhere in the middle of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at Garrick. This is your operation, he said. It's ours, Garrick said. Simple, clear, not elaborated on. Henderson looked at them both, and he looked at Clara sleeping in the sling, and he looked out the window at the main street of Doverfield for a long moment. Then he turned back. The Hale orchard's been good to my business for 20 years. Good to my father's business before that. He picked up his pen and put it down again. I'm not inclined to walk away from a good business relationship because of something Cedric Voss told me over dinner. He extended his hand across the desk. Elara shook it. They drove home in the late afternoon with Clara awake again and largely philosophical about the wagon, the sun going down behind the western ridge and turning the valley that particular heavy gold it turned in May evenings. And Garrick drove and Elara sat beside him, and they didn't talk much because they were both tired in the way you're tired after something that required everything. But it was the better kind of tired, the kind that comes after rather than before. You didn't have to do that, he said at some point. I know. She was looking at the valley. I wanted to. There's a difference, he said, using her words back to her. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. That small, real thing again, that warmth she'd been letting out in larger amounts since March. Yes, she said, there is. The survey dispute went nowhere, as Marsh had predicted. Voss's attorney sent one more letter in late May and then went quiet, which was the particular quiet of a legal argument that's been recognized as a dead end. The boundary oak stood where it had always stood. The stone wall ran where it had always run. The land was what it was. Voss himself they didn't see for a long time after that. Word came through Peterson in June that he'd had some troubles of his own. 2 of his workers had left for better terms elsewhere, and his hay crop had gone poor from the wet spring. The valley, which had been watching the Hale orchard's recovery with the specific attention people pay to things they're not sure about, was now watching it with something different. People came by in June, not in large numbers, not all at once, but the way people come when they've revised a previous conclusion and aren't quite willing to say so directly. Stopping in with reasons, with orders, with the kind of neighborly visit that is also an apology offered sideways. Ruth Deakins came with her daughter and stayed for lunch and held Clara for an hour, and told Elara firmly that she looked like she was finally sleeping properly. Some nights, Elara said, some nights is more than you had in January. Ruth looked at her over Clara's head. You look settled. Elara thought about that word. I'm getting there, she said. She thought about it afterward. Settled. She turned it over the way she turned problems over, looking at the edges. Settled was not the same as stuck. Settled was not the same as resigned. She'd spent so long in motion, in the months before October, that she'd started to think motion was the only honest state, that staying anywhere was a kind of self-deception, a refusal to acknowledge that everything was temporary and the bag should always be ready. She'd been wrong about that. Or not entirely wrong, but wrong in the specific way that useful truths become useless when you apply them past where they apply. Some things were temporary. Some things were genuinely not. The figuring out which was which, that was the work. That was the work nobody warned you about, the work that didn't have a handbook. June moved into July the way it did in a working orchard, fast and full, the days long and hot, and smelling of warm grass and ripening fruit. The early varieties starting to color, the farm humming with the particular intensity of a place that has things it needs to accomplish before the season turns. Garrick was everywhere in those weeks, managing workers and buyers and the logistics of the first harvest, and Elara was in the kitchen and the cellar and the rows with him when she could be, and back at the house with Clara when she couldn't. It was loud and imperfect and occasionally chaotic, and nothing about it was easy. She wouldn't have changed any of it. She knew that now. She'd arrived at knowing it the way she arrived at most conclusions, gradually, from the inside out, with the knowing settling into certainty before she could have told you exactly when it happened. One afternoon in late July, she put Clara down for her nap and went upstairs to her room for something, a shawl, because the evenings were getting that early autumn edge even in July, and she stopped in the middle of the room. The bag was beside the door. Same place it had been since October. Same dark canvas, same worn strap, same positioning that said, close enough to reach. She'd moved it incrementally over the months, further from the door in good periods, a few inches back when something frightened her, but it had never been anywhere but beside the door, ready, accessible, her one standing admission that she didn't fully trust the permanence of any of this. She stood and looked at it. She thought about October, the gate with the rusted hinge, the man in the muddy orchard who'd looked at her like she was a problem he was deciding whether to take on, the room with the stuck window and the old mattress, the kitchen that had been cold. She thought about the storm and the night Clara was born, and Garrick's boots on the steps 2 at a time, coming back as fast as I could. She thought about the eastern slope in March with blossoms not yet open and him saying, "The room is yours, not because of anything you've done, because I'm offering it." She thought about Henderson's office and Garrick saying, without hesitation, without qualification, "It's ours." She picked up the bag. She carried it to the bed and opened it and started unpacking it. Not frantically, not with ceremony, just steadily, the way she did things. She took out the winter clothes she'd had folded at the bottom since October, and she put them in the wardrobe, on the shelves, folded the way her grandmother had taught her to fold things. She took out Clara's small extra clothes, the ones she'd packed in there in the early weeks when she was still telling herself they might leave any day, and she brought them to Clara's room and put them in the little chest of drawers Garrick had brought up from the barn and sanded down and set there without being asked. She took out the few things that were purely hers, a book, a small mirror, her grandmother's folding knife that she'd had since she was 12. And she found places for them. The book on the shelf, the mirror on the little table by the window, the knife in the drawer of the nightstand where she could reach it if she needed it, but where it was not. For the first time in 4 months, something she was keeping ready. The bag itself she took to the wardrobe. She stood in front of it for a moment. She put the bag on the shelf at the top, the shelf at the back, the one behind her folded blankets. Not by the door, not within arm's reach of anywhere. Away. She went downstairs. Garrick was in the kitchen when she came down, at the table with the ledger that was increasingly a good news document, doing the calculations for the first harvest contracts. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he'd been reading it for months, the way she'd come to expect him to read it, accurately and without making a production of the accuracy. He looked at her for a moment. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes." She went to the stove to check what was there for dinner. The July yield numbers. "Did Foster give you the count on the Gravensteins?" "This morning. They're good. Better than I projected in March." "The soil amendment. It's working." She looked over her shoulder. "I told you it would." "You did." A pause. "Elara." She turned. He was looking at her with the particular look she'd learned, the one he used when he had something to say that he'd been working up to and had finally decided to say. He looked at the ceiling briefly, collecting himself, and she found this endearing in a way she probably would not have said out loud. "The papers from Marsh," he said. "The ones I've had in the desk since March." She waited. "I'd like to finish them, if that's something you want." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to decide on a timeline that isn't yours. I just want to know if it's a direction we're still..." "Garrick." She crossed the kitchen and stood across the table from him. "You're asking if I want to stay?" "Yes. In whatever form staying takes. However you want to, Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again. Simpler, no qualifications attached. "I want to stay." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see it land, watch it move through him. This man who had been as careful with his own feelings as she'd been with hers, both of them so practiced at not wanting things openly that wanting something openly felt like stepping off a ledge you couldn't see the bottom of. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It wasn't a grand scene. There was no sweep of emotion, no moment where the difficulty of everything they'd both carried dissolved into something clean and resolved. What there was instead was a man and a woman standing in a kitchen that smelled like summer and warm wood, both of them still somewhat uncertain, still carrying their own histories and their own damages, and the specific wariness that comes from having learned that nothing is guaranteed. What there was instead was the particular bravery of two people deciding to try, knowing it could fail, deciding to try anyway. Clara woke up from her nap about 3 minutes later and made this known at full volume, which broke whatever remained of the moment in the most accurate possible way, and Elara went upstairs and Garrick closed the ledger and put the kettle on. He went to his mother's desk that evening and took the papers out of the drawer and finished them. He signed where he needed to sign and left the rest for Elara to read when she was ready. She read them the next morning. She had questions. She always had questions. And he answered them, and she asked two more. And he answered those too, and she picked up the pen and signed without any further ceremony. He took the papers to Marsh the following week. August came, and with it the full harvest. The orchard doing what it had been building toward all year. The varieties coming in on their proper schedule. The yield on the western slope notably better than the previous years. The Gravensteins on the east slope the best he'd seen in a decade. The Gant brothers worked hard, and Cass worked in his quiet, methodical way, and Elara was in the middle of everything, managing the cold cellar and the preserved goods production, and the kitchen, with a hand that had gotten steadier and more certain with each month she'd been here. Henderson came in person for the August pickup, which he hadn't done in years. He walked the rows with Garrick and looked at the fruit and nodded in the way of a man confirming what he'd expected to find. Before he left, he shook Elara's hand again, and this time there was something in it. Not quite an apology, men like Henderson didn't do apologies directly, but something in the vicinity of one. "Good operation," he said. "Thank you," she said. "We think so." Voss's name came up less and less as the summer went on. He was managing his own troubles. The poor hay yield, the workers who'd left, some dispute about water rights on his north pasture that had apparently been festering for years. The valley's attention moved where attention always moves, toward the thing that was actually happening, and what was actually happening at the Hale orchard was a harvest that people drove past on the road and looked at and talked about. Good-looking fruit, good-looking farm. Whoever's running it now knows what they're doing. Word got around as it does. One afternoon in September, 2 days before the main winesap harvest was due to start, Elara was sitting on the back porch with Clara in her lap. Clara was 8 months old and was in the process of trying to eat a piece of apple that was clearly too large for her and would not be persuaded otherwise. The orchard was at the particular fullness of late season, heavy with fruit, the leaves going at the edges, the light coming in at the long afternoon angle that meant the days were already shortening even if the warmth hadn't left yet. Garrick came around the corner of the house from the barn and stopped when he saw them there. He stood for a moment, just stood, looking at them in the afternoon light. This woman who had pushed open his gate with everything she owned on her shoulder, and this small person who had arrived in a storm in the middle of winter and decided this was where she belonged. He stood with his coat over his arm and the September sun on the back of his neck, and he thought about his mother, who would have had things to say about all of this, probably quite a few things, and who would have been right about most of them. He sat down on the step beside Elara. She handed him a piece of apple without looking at him, the automatic gesture of someone who has been sharing things with another person long enough that it happens before thought. Clara looked at him with her serious, alert expression and held out the piece she'd been working on. "She's offering you her apple," Elara said. "I can see that. It's been in her mouth." "I know." He took it anyway. Clara looked satisfied and went looking for another piece. They sat on the back porch in the September afternoon, and the orchard stood around them in its fullness, this place that had come back from something real, that had been on the edge of being lost and wasn't anymore, that was not fixed, not perfect, never going to be either of those things, but alive in all the ways that matter for something to stay alive. Being tended, being understood, being worked at by people who were willing to work. "Can I ask you something?" Garrick said. She glanced at him. "You're going to anyway. That first morning, when you came through the gate." He looked at the orchard. "You'd knocked on 30 doors before mine." 31. 31. He paused. "What made you knock on one more?" She was quiet for a while. Clara found a new piece of apple and was satisfied. The afternoon light moved the long way through the trees. "I saw the fruit on the ground," she said finally. "I saw what was rotting, and I saw what was still on the trees, and I thought, there's someone here who hasn't given up completely. They're just stuck." A pause. "I know what stuck feels like. I thought maybe I could help unstick it." He looked at her. "And you thought a nearly 8 months pregnant woman with a travel bag was the right person for that job." "I thought I was the only person applying for it." The corner of her mouth moved. "Also, I was very tired and I needed somewhere to sit down." He laughed. It came out of him easily, the way laughing had started to come easily again over these months. and she smiled at the sound of it. Not the careful almost smile, the real one, the one that used her whole face when she let it. Here's what's true, and worth saying plainly. Most of the time, life does not save itself. It doesn't turn around on its own. It turns around because someone decides, in a moment when deciding feels impossible, to keep moving, to knock on one more door, to sort fruit that's already falling in the dark, because something in you will not accept that it's over. Elara Whitlock had spent 4 months learning how to survive alone, and the thing she didn't know, the thing she had to be shown slowly by a man who had his own version of the same lesson to learn, was that surviving alone and living are not the same thing. Surviving alone is what you do when you have to. Living is what you do when you finally let yourself have something to lose. Garrick Hale had stopped tending his orchard because he'd lost the person who made tending it feel like it meant something. What he hadn't understood yet, that October morning when a stranger pushed open his gate, was that meaning isn't stored in one person. It isn't something you run out of when they leave. It's something you make over and over out of whatever is in front of you, out of rotting fruit and cold cellars and rusted hinges and people who show up at your gate when you're not looking for anyone. Neither of them was fixed. That's the other true thing. Elara still had the wariness in her. She probably always would, that quick internal check of exits, that refusal to trust anything completely before it earned it. Garrick still had the grief, the missing of his mother that lived in the specific quality of the rows in the early morning when it was quiet and he was alone in them. Clara was going to grow up in a house made of 2 people who were still figuring themselves out, which is the house most people actually grow up in. And she would be fine, because the people in it were trying. The wine sap harvest came in on a warm September Thursday. All hands, the longest day of the year in terms of work. Everyone on the property moving from the rows to the barn to the cold cellar and back again in the organized motion of a harvest that has been planned and is being executed. By evening, the cellar had more in it than it had held in years, and Garrick stood in the doorway of it, looking at the shelves, and felt his mother's voice in his ear the way he sometimes did. Not sad anymore, or not only sad, saying, "There it is." He went back to the house. Elara was at the kitchen table with Clara in her lap, the baby finally running out of energy after a day of being entertained by the unusual activity and expressing opinions about it. The kitchen smelled like dinner, something real on the stove, and the light inside was the warm kind that kitchens have at the end of long days. He came in and washed his hands at the basin and turned, and she was watching him across the kitchen. This woman who had unpacked her bag and put it at the back of a shelf, who had signed papers with her own hand and her own name, who had made this place hers the same slow, careful way she did everything. "Good harvest," she said. "Good harvest," he agreed. Clara reached up and grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair, and Elara said, "Ow," without particular urgency, and untangled it with the patience that never seemed to run out no matter how many times Clara performed this specific maneuver. Garrick sat down across from them and looked at the kitchen. His mother's kitchen, his kitchen, their kitchen, all of those things true at once without canceling each other out. And outside the evening was coming down over the orchard, and somewhere on the property the last of the work sounds were going quiet, and the peepers had started in the creek again the way they did every evening, and the season was turning, but the harvest was in and everything that needed to be there was there. He looked at Elara. "Should I clear more space?" he said. "In the wardrobe for the rest of your things." She looked up from Clara. She looked at him for a moment with that level gaze, and then a smile came across her face, slow and real, the one she'd stopped saving for when she really meant it, because she'd figured out that she could spend it freely and it wouldn't run out. "Yes," she said. "I think you should." Outside, the orchard stood in the last of the September light, patient and full, and exactly where it had always been. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Clara laughed at something she alone could see, the sudden clear sound of it filling every corner of the room, and neither of them looked away.